Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Bellows with Stony Creek Colors. Stony Creek Colors makes clean and safe plant-based dyes for artisan and industrial dyers, giving a traceable and transparent source of plant dyes. Today's video, we are going to be making an indigo vat using iron as our reducing agent. The iron vat, as is commonly known, is perfect for dyeing cellulosics like cotton, linen, bamboo into deep and beautiful blues without some of the stripping that might happen with some of the chemically reduced indigo vats. Before we begin, I want to just go over some of the safety equipment that you'll want to use when you're making the indigo iron vat. These include a dust mask, safety goggles, and then gloves. The solutions I will be working with are alkaline, so when you're doing your dipping, it is important to wear gloves. The materials that we'll use in addition to our safety materials today are indigo. We'll be making this vat from Stony Creek Colors 25% natural indigo. We also have calcium hydroxide, which is commonly known as hydrated lime or pickling lime or slaked lime. For our reducing agent, we'll be using iron sulfate heptahydrate, which is commonly known as ferrous sulfate. It's important to make sure that the iron that you're using is not already oxidized, so it shouldn't appear rust colored or black. If that's the case, your iron will not be able to serve in the reducing function that's necessary for this vat. So make sure that you're using ferrous sulfate and not some other oxidized iron sources that you might be able to use for iron mortising, for example. All of these materials are available in the Stony Creek Colors iron kit, and then obviously you'll want to have your material, whether it's cotton t-shirts or linens, for the material you'll be dyeing. And then today's indigo video, we'll be actually doing our dye bath in a 5-gallon bucket. The iron vat's great because you don't have to really heat up the vat continuously, and so if you're looking for a kind of no frills way to get started in indigo dyeing, as long as you're able to troubleshoot the problems that you might have with the vat, this one's great because you can leave it just in room temperature in the ambient air and not have to worry about having a method for heating. So it's totally fine to do in a plastic bucket. Of course, we'll need some hot water for getting the vat started, some materials for stirring up the vat. We have a thermometer, but that's not absolutely critical, and a way to both weigh the dye materials for your weight of fiber, but then also to weigh out your dye ingredients. You'll want a scale and some kind of vessels for both weighing your powdered material and then also making up your stock solution. So in this case, today we're going to be using making our stock solution in these small or relatively small wide mouth ball jars. If you have access to a larger pot with a lid or one of the taller like 4-pint ball jars, those are really ideal for this type of stock solution. Okay, so we just finished measuring out all of our dye materials that we'll need to make the stock solution. The important thing to know about the stock solution is it's almost like a super reduced vat that you're going to allow to go into a really complete reduction and then add it to your larger vat or the larger vessel. So the important things to know about the stock solution are you want to give it time to go into reduction, and it's awesome to do this in a clear or a see-through container so that you can really visualize when the vat is ready or when the stock solution is ready for using it. The first thing we'll start with is our indigo powder. So here I'm using the Stony Creek Colors 25% indigo powder. If you were using indigo paste, let's just say, for example, so this is already a wetted out indigo paste that is in liquid form, you can skip the wetted out stage. But in this scenario, we're going to actually add hot water to the indigo powder. I have this water preheated. And we're not going to want to add too much water because we're dealing here with some very small stock solutions. Or the container that we have for our stock solution is very small. So ultimately you want to make sure that you don't add so much water that you don't have room for the rest of your ingredients in this stock container. So I'm wetting out the indigo here, and it's really okay to stir at this time because you don't have a reduced vat. So you might hear for people that are doing indigo dyeing that you want to keep oxygen out of the vat. That's totally true. Right now all we have is blue wetted out indigo, so we don't have a vat yet. The vatting is what takes place when the indigo is actually in reduction, and that's the scenario that we're trying to achieve. So here I have it pretty well wetted out, and I can tell that by going along the bottom and seeing that I don't have much actual powder down there. Now, one scenario that is often employed is to add something like marbles or some rocks or something. So here I have some fairly clean rocks. I'm just gonna put a couple in the bottom to let me really like shake up any of the remaining indigo that's at the bottom of this vessel. So I can see when I turn it with the lid tightly on it that I actually do have some powder down here at the bottom, and so I just want to make sure I have enough to get that all into solution. The indigo won't actually technically be in solution. That's when it goes into its soluble form. This indigo is insoluble, so we really just want to get it not all caked up at the bottom. This is truly one of your last chances to like stir up the indigo vat or the indigo, so make sure you take that time to have thoroughly wetted out indigo. Now this can just sit here. It doesn't matter if the lid's on or off, and we're going to make up the calcium hydroxide. Here I have 44 grams of calcium hydroxide. The indigo that we're using is 25% natural indigo, so we have 50 grams of the natural indigo in there. If you're using, for example, our 40% indigo powder, you would use a little bit less. So normally you'd want to have your dust mask on during this. I don't have mine on so you can hear me in the video, but this is the making of the calcium hydroxide paste. Of all of the materials for this, this is actually one of the ones that's more challenging to wet out because the solubility, it actually needs quite a lot of water to make sure this wets out. So make sure you're really stirring up from the bottom and that there's no chunks of calcium hydroxide or this slaked lime that is left at the bottom of your jar. And then we're going to just rinse the spoon off. And as I mentioned, you do want to be mindful that you're not adding too much water to all of these because ultimately all of this liquid has to fit into one container. I'm going to use the least water, hopefully, for this iron and get this all to go into solution. This ferrous sulfate, which will be FeSO4, you want to just make sure that it doesn't have any down at the bottom, but you don't need quite as much water, and I'm going to kind of break up the pieces that are down at the bottom that I can see with my spoon. So we have our dissolved indigo paste, and we have our pasted out calcium hydroxide, and then we have our iron. So we'll add all of these materials to the indigo vat or into the indigo stock, and I'll actually just leave the marbles in here. It's totally fine to dye with their rocks, but it's totally fine to dye with the rocks in here. So what I'm gonna actually do is add the calcium hydroxide to here, and then that way I can see if there's any still not in solution down at the bottom. So I have a little bit of stray kind of chunks down there, and I'm going to make sure I just dissolve them all before I pour them into this indigo. Our water is probably somewhere between 100 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty good for the iron vat. It doesn't need to be too hot, so you wouldn't want to like take a bath in this water, but it's not boiling by any means. So we have a little bit more to do to get this up into solution. I have a little left in there. I'm going to leave it for a minute to make sure that we have room for the iron, which we definitely should. But I can also see that there's a little bit down in there from the iron water. A little that didn't go into the solution from the iron. So I really cannot iterate enough how important it is to make sure you're using ferrous sulfate if you're trying to make an iron vat. Any other kind of iron will not cause the chemical reaction that you actually need. So we have a little bit of headspace left. I don't want to add actually all the way up to the brim. I want to just leave a little bit of room in case there's any frothing that needs to go on by the vat, in the vat. But obviously I want to get that last little bit of calcium hydroxide if I can. So here we have all the stage set for making stock solution. It's super thick. That's one thing that is important to know about the iron vat. You are going to have a lot of sediment, and that also goes for the stock solution. So here we are. I'm going to save every little bit of indigo that we can, since we know how hard it is to make it. And I'm going to use a technique that's kind of like rolling a little bit just to make sure that I get a pretty thorough mixing. Before you do that, make sure your lid is really tight. And I like this method just to make sure all the ingredients are really incorporated. So this is a very concentrated stock solution. Normally it would be great to do this in a mason jar that's about double the size of this, so you can see what's going on. Obviously if you're in a lidded pot, you're not going to be able to rotate it, so you can actually just stir it pretty well. And then you'll notice, obviously I put the lid on it. That is what we are doing to keep the oxygen out, so this can actually go into reduction. And for the successful indigo reduction to take place, oxygen should really be excluded. We obviously have some oxygen in the water, but in this scenario, keep the lid on your stock solution, and we're actually just going to let this sit here for anywhere between 1 and 3 hours. You'll see the reduction starting to take place. Really, it will appear to go from the blue state of the indigo into like a yellowish to brownish color. So when you have blue indigo, it's the oxidized form of indigo. You want to go towards the leuco form of indigo, or the reduced indigo. And for the iron vat, that will take on a brownish color. For other types of vats, it will normally appear more greenish. And so we're going to actually set this off to the side. If you're working outside and it's really cold, which is not the scenario we have today in Tennessee, you can actually let any of the stock solutions sit in a bucket of warm water. You don't need to heat the iron vat, as I mentioned, but keeping it a little bit warmer will help the reduction to go a little bit faster. We've measured out our ingredients for making the vat solution. So this is some more calcium hydroxide and some of the ferrous sulfate. We're going to add water to this just like we did for the stock solution, except we don't have any indigo in this case. So I have some water heated up, and in this case you can add sufficient water because you're going to be adding this to your stock solution. Just make sure that if you've added the water to your bucket already, you haven't filled it up so high so that you don't have any room for the stock solution or these extra materials. So the purpose of this is really to make sure that your vat is alkaline and in a reducing environment before we add the indigo stock solution. So just as a reminder, we have our indigo stock solution waiting up to 2 or 3 hours to go into reduction, and here we're just preparing the vat, the vessel and the solution for the vatting to take place. We have the iron here, the ferrous sulfate. These are all going into the same container, so I'm not super worried about using the same spoon for everything. This is one of your last chances to really stir everything well, and so make sure that you don't have any powder down at the bottom. Before we begin, one more thing that I like for our iron vat especially is to put some kind of grating down at the bottom of your vat. Particularly, there is a lot of sediment that is created during this vat. I'm going to put this metal grate, it's a stainless steel grating, inside the vat, and ultimately what this is going to do is when I'm dipping my fabric in for the indigo dyeing, while I try to be careful and keep it up above the sediment, this is just like one extra layer of protection from that sediment. It would be ideal if your vat's big enough, or you can have a taller container that's just the same level of skinniness, where you can have the grating up a little bit higher to keep all that sediment down at the bottom. When you go later to stir this vat, you'll want to remove the grate if you can. So make sure you have gloves long enough to get into the vat and grab the grate out of there, or tongs or something that you can do for that. So you want to have your grate just down at the bottom of the vat, and we're going to add in our ingredients. We'll stir in our iron, and there's a little bit left in there. I'm going to just kind of make sure that powder is really well dissolved. We want to really take this chance while we're able to stir the vat to make sure all of our powders are well dissolved. So we don't have any indigo yet in this vat. It's just the alkaline and slightly reducing environment that we'll want to have ready, so that once our indigo stock solution is ready for dyeing, we can add it in here and not disrupt the reduction process that's taking place. If you're making this right before you add your stock solution, it's great to let this rest at least like 20 or 30 minutes before beginning. So we're going to let these two stock solutions and our alkaline vat environment just rest for a little bit and wait for the indigo to go into reduction. Now I'm going to use a method of adding this stock solution that I like to do with really like lots of the kinds of indigo vats, where I take the mason jar and I kind of submerge it almost. Instead of pouring it into the vat, you can imagine that that would add a lot of oxygen. I'm actually going to submerge the whole container and dump it in that way. I made a super duper concentrated stock solution here because I had wanted to fit the whole recipe in one mason jar. And so now I'm trying to get all this sediment out of the jar at the same time. One of the reasons we make a stock solution is to have just a pretty good solid reduction before we go into the whole vat. It just helps speed up the time to get to dye, right? So here we have a little bit of sediment left in the jar. Since I still have some space available in this jar, I could add more hot water to it. I can also just fill this with water and sort of let it sit for later. I'm going to actually just sort of swirl a little bit to remove this and get it down into the container. The iron vat is going to have a lot of sediment, so you want to make sure that you put your grate in after you do this kind of final stirring step, and definitely before you begin any dyeing. We're going to let this sit an extra like at least an hour or two to go all the way into reduction because of this color, and the oxidized indigo at the surface indicates that below the surface is not oxidized indigo. I'm feeling the rocks down at the bottom that I had dumped in here also, so if you don't think you'll like that, remove the rocks or marbles before you start. We're going to put a lid on this and let it sit for about an hour. If you want to come back tomorrow and do more iron vat dyeing, obviously watch the video so you know what you're in for, but you can let this sit and resume indigo dyeing at any different day. With the iron vat particularly, I like to stir it every single day in the kind of like leading up to the dyeing, because more and more sediment is going to form at the bottom, and you don't want all your indigo to settle down there as well. You want to make sure that there's enough of the reducing iron up in the solution to get going. So after adding our stock solution to our iron vat bucket, we have now let it wait a couple hours and are ready to test to see if the vat's ready for dyeing. There are a couple ways that we can do this. We really like this eyedropper method, or using a teacup or some kind of cup to see what color the solution is below the surface of the vat. So you can see right on the vat I have sort of this almost translucent, like sheen, coppery sort of sheen. It's not quite coppery, but almost like a grayish sheen. But below the surface, when I pull up this eyedropper, I'm actually seeing like an amber color solution, and that's just right for the iron vat. So you want to make sure that your solution is not blue or super dark green for the iron vat specifically, and it should take on more of a brownish tone. So we know it's ready to go, and we're going to get ready for dyeing. You definitely want to wear gloves when working with the indigo iron vat, because the solution is super alkaline. Our pH is somewhere around 11 right now, and so that's really high, and you want to protect your fingers. So before we actually put our fabric in to dye with, I really like to scrape off this top surface, just so that that later doesn't come onto my fabric. So if you do a lot of printing, you can save that material, or you can kind of dye something with this method that you're more like getting just a surface treatment on, not really doing a full dyeing of it. So now we've scraped the sort of top layer off to make room for getting our shirt in without that getting onto it. And we're going to spread out our shirt. I do have a little bit of blue on my hand, so hopefully that doesn't stain the shirt too much. And I'm going to actually, when I put it into the water, I am going to really try to do that sort of slowly and at one time. I don't want to lift the shirt in and out of the water, or out of the vat rather, because that's going to add a lot of oxygen. So I want to put the shirt in like one step and then submerge it, keeping it held under the water and moving it around with my fingers to try as much as possible to spread out the shirt in this bucket. Now, if you're doing a lot of indigo dyeing, truly investing in some kind of system that's bigger than a 5-gallon bucket to do the iron vat with is a great idea, because any time that you can kind of increase the distance of your vat from that sediment at the bottom, the more likely you're going to stay away from the sediment of the iron and the other sort of what's settled to the bottom of this vat. So I'm moving it around underneath the liquid. I'm not picking my hands up and out of the water. I'm just kind of spreading the shirt under the surface with my fingers. If you find that the shirt rises to the surface or the fabric, just kind of pull it back underneath. If you have an air bubble in there, kind of try to poke it out. So what you're going to see if the shirt does pop up to the surface is actually like it's going to be bright green. In your first couple of dips, you're just loading the shirt up with leuco indigo or reduced indigo, and once we take it out of the vat and expose it to the air or to oxygen, or we put it in water, it's going to transform into the oxidized blue form, which is the indigo form that we know and love. So here, you know, that first dip can be 30 seconds or 1 minute, and I'm going to now remove it from the bath. I'm sort of slowly taking it out, and I have actually squeezed it out under the surface as much as I could, because I don't want to take all the indigo vat with me into this rinse bucket. So you have two options. You know, with the iron vat, the sooner you can submerge it in water, usually in case you did get some sediment on it, it will be good for sort of rubbing it off and making sure that you didn't, you know, you don't want to stain with any sediment that's more rust colored. So it picked up a little sediment when I was probably submerging it and didn't have my hand in the vat underneath. I got a little bit. If you do see like, oh, I have a huge spot of iron, you can actually rub it under running water. You can do that before or after you do sort of this first soak. So if you're if you prefer to watch this oxidation occur, right in front of you, you don't have to submerge right away. But actually what's happening is this is slowly coming from the yellow-green color coming out of the vat and oxidizing into the blue form. So we have really awesome blue for our first dip of the vat. That means it's working really nicely. It's in a really good reduction. And with all indigo vats, no matter whether you're using the iron vat or fermentation vat or the fructose vat, you are going to want to build up the color through dipping it multiple times. So you're not going to want to just leave it in there really long that first dip to get a darker blue. You're not going to want to add more indigo than the recipe calls for to get a darker blue. Of course, experiment with different techniques that might work for you. Feel free to go deviate from the recipes as you advance in your practice and start paying attention to what works for you. But for all indigo dyeing, no matter what vat, you always want to progressively build up the color with multiple dips. Because unlike other dyes, indigo is sort of forming by layering on the surface, and so it's becoming deeper and deeper by kind of like this stacking of the indigo molecules and adhering to the fiber. So here is an awesome blue color. So here's our first dip, and no matter what, even if you want a very light blue color, you really need to dip a minimum of 3 times to build up kind of a consistent enough base, and it really helps to get more even dyeing, especially if you're dyeing in a very sort of small scale fashion, like in a small bucket, because it's just is hard to move the fabric around totally adequately to keep a very smooth layer. So now what we're going to do is let this hang a little longer to oxidize. So you don't want to go right back into the vat if there's any green or yellow whatsoever. So it becomes a little harder to see as you are dyeing a darker and darker shirt, sort of like how long do I need to go to make sure it's fully oxidized. But anywhere that is not blue yet and you redip it, so if it's still in the Luco form, you're potentially not going to get a very level dyeing when you do that. So we're going to hang these up and dye a couple more, and then come back and re-dye or get a couple darker shades with this one and a couple other shirts. When we know our shirts are fully oxidized and totally blue, no more sort of fluorescent green sections around, we're going to keep dipping them. And so this one I've already dipped a couple of times. And if I loved this color, for example, I would want to make sure to dip it in the vat even 1 or 2 more times, because once your shirt's dried, it's always going to dry lighter than what it was. What you see when it's dark. And so really, if you fall in love with a color that comes out of your vat, you're just going to have faith to dip it a couple more times, 1 or 2 more times, to make sure that when it dries, it will land at that beautiful color you saw when wet. If you are dyeing a piece of fabric, you can always cut a swatch off of the edge of the fabric and then, wash and dry it and see what that kind of dry color will look like. Or if you have a t-shirt, you can't cut it up, you can always get a hair dryer and dry a kind of small piece of it. When we get to the color that we want, and then a shade or 2 darker to make sure it dries how we want it, we're going to do a final, plunge it into the water to do a rinse. And then with the vinegar, we're going to do an acid soak with either vinegar or citric acid. The citric acid can be great with the iron vat, because if there is any iron that sort of got onto the fabric, it can help to sort of solubilize that and hopefully get it off of there. So, vinegar obviously is really easy to come by, so you can just use regular white household vinegar to do your soaking step. And really what we're doing there with the vinegar soak after indigo dyeing is neutralizing the fabric. So we want to get it back to a pH that is kind of better for the fabric over the long haul. So somewhere around pH 7 as opposed to the pH 11 of this vat, which is really alkaline. So acidic bath of a vinegar soak or a citric acid soak is going to take it back in the other direction and help us prolong the life of our fabric, certainly. So I have been doing my second dips anywhere from like 30 seconds up to 2 minutes, and it really, this is depending on how dark you want your garment to become. As you progressively do more and more dips, of course, you're not going to get that like fluorescent yellow-green color that we first saw because you have a blue shirt already. see now, like I've been stirring up a lot of sediment from the bottom because my grate is very, very small. So I have some iron here that has the potential to cause some staining. You can run this underwater and sort of rub it out to make sure that you can get the iron sediment that's formed off of there. If you have kind of like a precious garment that you absolutely cannot tolerate any iron staining on whatsoever, or if you're dyeing to a really light color where it would be just super obvious, you can also do a citric acid soak like right in the middle of your dyeing routine. So if you were worried about that when you're just starting out, certainly you can have a bucket ready to go with citric acid even next to it in addition to your rinse bucket. And so that way you can sort of figure out, you know, if you think you'll have a lot of sediment because you don't have a good grate system or because your bucket's pretty shallow, like this sediment might be as like deep as here. So we don't have a ton of room to work with for spreading out the shirt. So I actually have a couple other shirts still soaking in here, and they're still actually haven't fully oxidized yet. So I'm gonna make sure to hang those up. This one is only had one dip, whereas this one soaking has now had about 4 dips. So obviously you can see that with multiple dips, we are really building up the color in an awesome way. And of course, that's how deep, through more dips, is how you're going to control getting a darker and darker color. So I'll hang these and we'll keep going. After you're done with your indigo dyeing with the iron vat, so you've achieved the colors that you like, it's time to do a couple of steps for maintenance of the vat. So with the iron vat particularly, you know, one of the reasons people love it is because you don't need to keep it heated. So if you're dyeing outside, you can keep it outside, you can bring it in the house, but you'll want to put a tight lid on it so that you keep the oxygen from really like continuously coming across the surface of the vat itself. The more head space that you can actually have closed up, so the more that your liquid is close to the lid, the less like sort of room for oxygen to get trapped inside the vat before you put it to bed. So one thing that you can definitely do is add a bit of boiling water to the vat at the end of the day. So this is a kind of a way of heating it, which is good for all vats really, to bring up the water level, because obviously as we've been dyeing, we've been removing a lot of water from it. You don't need to add more stock solution. Certainly every successive day that you're doing dyeing, you're removing indigo from the vat, so eventually you are going to need to replenish the indigo in the vat or just start a completely new iron vat. But if your vat's still dyeing well, feel free to just start it back up the next time you want to use it without adding any more indigo. What you definitely want to do on a regular basis and after you're done dyeing, every time you finish a dyeing session, is to stir it up. And so this is really just literally how you added the material when you actually added your stock solution, but taking just some care to make sure that any sediment on the bottom you're sort of bringing up off the surface. And here it is okay to, of course, form some bubbles, because you want to make sure that you are bringing up what's down at the bottom, but don't be so aggressive or add extra oxygen that you don't need to, because ultimately you're trying to maintain the reduction and just make sure that some of that iron that might have settled to the bottom is coming back up into solution. So give it a good stirring, and then you're going to want to just put the lid on it. Top it off with water depending on how much you lost for that day's dyeing, and then put the lid on tight and store it and have fun at your next dyeing. There are a few troubleshooting items to be aware of for the indigo iron vat. While you're dyeing, a few different things can happen. One certainly is that your vat starts running out of indigo. As you're taking indigo out of the vat and putting it onto your fabric, you're going to get more and more depleted. More commonly and often of concern for new dyers using the iron vat is when the vat goes into more of an oxidative state. the indigo must be reduced into the leuco-indigo form in order to be picked up by the fabric. And there are a few ways to troubleshoot that this is what might be going on with your vat. We have an eyedropper here, and you can also use something that allows you to sort of peer into the vat like a white cup to understand what color the solution is under the vat. So I've just placed the dropper into the vat and picked up some of the liquid, and actually I can see that it's super duper clear. So to me, this indicates that a lot of the reduced indigo and other reducing materials and alkalizing agents have settled to the bottom of the vat. There's a lot of sediment with the indigo vat, and normally up in suspension will be the leuco-indigo. There's another way, if you don't have an eyedropper, of evaluating whether this has happened, and that is certainly when you're putting your fabric in and going through what you would normally use as a dyeing process. So let's say you're holding it in there for somewhere between 30 seconds and 5 minutes, and once you've removed the fabric, there's absolutely no green whatsoever in the picked up onto the fabric, and normally, of course, what would happen is this green would oxidize into blue. All we have is a little bit of blue sort of sediment or precipitate that has formed on the surface of the vat, and that's what's been picked up by the fabric. This vat is completely out of order and needs a sharpening or refreshing. In the case of this vat, I know that there's sufficient indigo left in it. I know that because we only dyed a couple of pieces so far, but there's been some temperature swings. We're outside, and also just generally it's been a little bit exposed to oxygen throughout the day, and so we want to take the response of getting it back into reduction, but we don't need to add more indigo. If you have been using your vat a lot and you think that it genuinely is out of indigo, you might be getting a very, very light blue color when you dye, but when you pick up the liquid with the dropper, it looks like more of a brownish, strong vat. Then you can make more stock solution and add it to this vat in order to refresh the vat. But in this case, we're out of oxidation, and so there are two strategies we can employ. One is certainly to just stir it and try to get the material back up, or the sediment back up into the vat. Another method is to do the stirring but also slightly heat the vat. So that's what we're going to do for today's video. I have a drum heater on this 5-gallon bucket. We don't have a hot plate available to us today, and we were trying to do everything in a 5-gallon plastic bucket. If you had a stainless steel pot and a way to heat up small amounts of liquid, you could actually just take a gallon or so out of this bucket, heat just that part up, and then reincorporate the heated up liquid back into this vat. If you wanted to go that route, you could certainly add more of the calcium hydroxide and the iron to that heated up liquid, so you have a very kind of strong reducing and alkali base there. So we're going to actually stir this up pretty well, and then we're going to have to let the vat rest for at least an hour, certainly, because now we are adding a lot of oxygen sort of intentionally. We're doing this as a reminder to get the material up to, kind of up in the solution. So over time, as it settles, and as a reminder, you want to really stir your iron vat pretty regularly so that you keep the reducing agent and the indigo up into the solution. So we're both heating up the vat and we're stirring it, and then we're going to let it sit. And in a couple hours, we'll check on this vat again, and hopefully it will be actually ready for dyeing. Of course, if you are want to be absolutely sure not to get any sediment on the fabric that you're dyeing, you want to wait a little bit more than just kind of the minimum 1 hour to get it into reduction. You want time for the indigo to come up and go back into reduction, but then also, of course, let the sediment drop out. So we've given this a really pretty good stirring. I have the heater set to about 80 degrees Celsius, which is about 180 degrees. Actually, I have it on 70°C. You can bring it up to about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. If you just heat it ever so slightly, that's fine. And this method for refreshing should work even without temperature, but if you want it to work a little bit faster, you can add a temperature. We'll just peer in at what's happening on below the surface. You can actually see that we have sort of a greenish brown color here, and still we can see the oxidized indigo up at the surface. So there's definitely some reducing action and indigo, reduced indigo in here, and we're going to let this sit for a little bit longer, hoping that it will turn really a little more brownish. So I'm going to put the lid on it tightly to keep that oxygen out. We're going to keep it heating and come back in a little bit. We've now washed and dried the iron-dyed indigo t-shirts that we dyed in our natural indigo iron vat. And we wanted to share some of the results with you, and also just kind of summarize what we learned in this video tutorial on dyeing with the iron vat. So one of the great things about the iron vat, certainly, and all indigo dyeing, is that you can get a really wide range of blue colors. So we have everything from kind of a medium dark indigo all the way through to light indigo. And with the iron vat in particular, you know, you might notice when you're doing your dyeing, for example, in this scenario, we have the shirt, which is a cotton jersey, and then this ribbing, which actually is made from the same piece of fabric. So it's not the case that our ribbing is something different like polyester, but you do want to be really mindful that you're working with either consistent fabric or that the colors you achieve might be different. But in the case of this iron vat, you can definitely see that the ribbing that was picked up from these shirts did obtain sort of a slightly different tone to it. So it's a pretty cool look, and we think that if you get something like this, that's just be mindful that different areas of the shirt, especially if they're different fibers or have a different handling or treatment to them, might pick up the dye differently. The iron vat in particular has obviously, as we've recommended, the most affinity for cellulosic fibers, so things like cotton and bamboo and linen. So make sure if you are doing this dyeing, you only use those kind of plant-based fibers. Now, if you compare the iron vat results to something like the hydro vat, which is a chemically reduced vat, or the fermentation vat, we definitely notice when we're doing most of our indigo dyeing with the iron vat that the result almost has like a more greenish cast to it, almost more like greenish gray. Not as extreme as what we notice in the reducing sugars vat, but definitely a slightly kind of less true indigo blue compared to the fermentation vat, for example. So each vat, because the indigo is being chemically reduced and then going back into the fiber, you know, there can be different arrangements of those indigo molecules on the cotton fiber due to sort of like pi stacking and these chemical interactions that are occurring when the molecule goes into indigo, into the leuco indigo, and then back onto the shirt. So each actually method of reduction can yield you different tones of your indigo, and so that's something just certainly to be mindful of, and know that if you're changing vat types, you might expect a slightly different cast to the indigo that you're obtaining. So in all of our dyeing videos that we've showed you today, we've used the Stony Creek Colors natural indigo powder, all at the 25% purity. So it's not that you know, we had different indigos going into the vat. It is that the reduction system can sort of contribute to what the different tones that you're getting onto your fabric. Of course, with the iron vat, as we've discussed during the tutorial, if you do get any iron sediment that got onto your fabric, you can soak it in citric acid. You can try to rinse it out right as you're using it, and then certainly you can keep dyeing it to try to get it darker, although if you do have stained fabric that you're trying to over dye, the indigo iron vat is not the best for that, because the iron can often kind of exacerbate stains that are already present on the fabric. So if you have a shirt you love and you want to over dye it in indigo to keep it as a shirt you love, I would probably recommend the fermentation vat or one of the other vats instead of the iron vat, because if you're trying to hide that instead of exacerbate the stain, then the iron vat will make it worse. So again, you know, we also have shared with you videos on dyeing with the fructose vat or the reducing sugars vat, the hydro vat or chemically reduced vats, and the fermentation vat, which is a bacterial reduction vat. This iron vat video hopefully will help demystify indigo dyeing and using the iron vat, and love to see what you create with it. Happy dyeing!